But I'm going to start by going to Singapore with James Dorsey, who was with us, and he's a senior contributor and a very noted writer with Inside Arabia. A couple of our listeners said, hey, are you ever going to have a segment that you're not talking about COVID-19? Well, here's one now. Talk about something else, the Gulf. And James is with us now on Inside Arabia, which is my go-to place for news in the Middle East. Go to InsideArabia.com, based in Washington, D.C. He had a story up the other day that was really great, just to look at what other is still happening around the world. Like, we're not covering anything. Talking about Gulf security. And the title of his piece was Arab Gulf States Have No Good Options. James Dorsey with us live from Asia. James, great to have you, man.
John, it's always a pleasure to be with you.
No, I love having you on. You're my fun guy. I know we got to start this every week. Got to keep up with your family. How's your family? How's your wife? How's everybody's health?
She's fine. She's out of the hospital. She went for her first walk today. She's well on the way to be fully recovered.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. All right. Well, thank you.
Absolutely.
Tell her I said hi. I know you guys were pretty worried there for a while, so I'm happy. And it was good to get outside and take a walk, I'll tell you that. What's been the situation in Singapore where you are now? What's the government doing as far as this COVID is concerned?
Essentially, Singapore was initially the gold standard on how to deal with the crisis. That it no longer is. It now has among the highest number of cases in Asia. Having said that, I must say that together with Qatar, Singapore and Qatar are the two countries with the lowest death rate, both of them under 1%. So in that sense, they performed very well. Where things went wrong, however, is that in the initial phase, the Singaporean government did not pay a lot of attention to the migrant workers. And that led, once they really had it looked like they had the pandemic under control, that led to an enormous spike. Some 80, maybe 85% of all cases in Singapore and they're about now close to 20,000 in a country of 5 million, are migrant workers. And so what you're seeing is the curve, if you wish, of cases among migrant workers having spiked, and it now runs between 600 and 1,000 a day, whereas the numbers for Singaporeans and permanent residents of the country are below 20 and very often below 10 a day.
I know the issue there was the migrant workers, right? They live 8-10 to one little place, and there was not a lot of attention paid.
15 to 20 to a room in some cases.
James, it's even hard to imagine that in America. I mean, it really is. I mean, think about I just want everybody right now to think the last time you stayed in a hotel. Think about putting 15 or 20 people in there, or think about one room, like a one-room apartment in New York, and putting 15 people there. I mean, that's basically what it is. But James, let me ask you this before we get to our story. So, Qatar also has the lowest death rate, and Qatar has a huge migrant workers. I mean, here's a country of almost 3 million people, and only 250,000 of them are Qataris. That's another stat that blows people's minds, James. 80% of Qatar is migrant workers. Why haven't they had the same problem that Singapore had?
They have, and so does Saudi Arabia. So Qatar has about 17,000 cases at the moment, and the overwhelming majority are migrant workers. The same is true in Saudi Arabia.
Right.
And in all three cases, you have a function of two things. You have a function of social standards of living, standards of housing, and so on. The same thing that you're finding in the United States with the Black American population, who have much higher rates of infection. And so the solution is, and that's something, to be fair to Singapore, that they are thinking about, that these are no longer tolerable conditions, because they actually do constitute a health hazard, not only to those who live in those conditions, but to the world at large, particularly in a world in which pandemics are happening. Just look at the last 20 years. We've had 4, 5, 6 of them, in which pandemics are going to occur more frequently.
Well, let's see if we can get this one behind us. But when you talk about, James, the 15 or 20 people in a room, I spent the last week. I traveled around the country, as you know, and I spent the last week in the Mississippi Delta, which is the poorest region in America. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting. I was talking to a guy last night who was from the Delta and then got a good job, traveled around, and came back. And he said, I would bring friends of mine, because he went to school in Virginia at Hampton University. He said, I would bring friends of mine home, and they would see the dilapidated houses. And he said, everybody's seen these, so they would say, okay, well, that's a dilapidated house. But he said the difference in the Delta, in the Mississippi Delta, is that people actually live in them. You've only seen them where they're abandoned. See, here, they got like 3 families in them. So, it's kind of the same thing when you say 15 people to a room. A lot of Americans don't understand, how difficult it is in some areas. All right, we're with James Dorsey. He's senior contributor with Inside Arabia. This is my source for Middle Eastern news. When I want to read about the Gulf, that's where I go. Go to InsideArabia.com. I got a bookmark. You need to do that, too. They're based in Washington, D.C. They do a great job. Your piece on Gulf security, which I thought was fascinating, Arab states have no good option. And there's a couple things here that this virus has exposed. You want to elaborate on those, James?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think that in some ways, it's early days, but in some ways, Iran comes out of this as a winner, as maybe as idiosyncratic as that may sound. And the reason that I say that is that in the Saudi-Iranian rivalry, the Saudis had a few advantages. They had financial muscle. They're losing that financial muscle. This is a country that's going to a reasonably high rate of debt to GDP, and needs to diversify and needs to invest domestically. And it's not clear that that's how that's going to happen. They've also lost, with the collapse of the oil markets, they've lost the ability to manipulate the oil price. And finally, they've lost some of their religious legitimacy. You've had the Umrah, which is what's called the small pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca, canceled. Mm-hmm. It's almost certain that the Hajj, the major pilgrimage to Mecca, will be canceled this year. Mosques were closed. They're now slowly opening in Saudi Arabia. With other words, Saudi Arabia's religious outreach has been significantly diminished. And that comes at a moment at which not only Saudi Arabia, but Gulf states in general, really no longer have a major or a big power, if you wish, in other words, United States, China, or Russia, on which they can wholly rely. They don't know whether or not any of these forces or powers will come to their defense. Now, that can mean two things. It can mean that the conflicts get even more entrenched, or it can mean that they review and start looking at ways of dialing down the tension. Now, even if they do, the problem, of course, is that you have two independent but related conflicts, namely between the United States and Iran, and between Israel and Iran, that the Gulf states can't control.
So how does this make Iran a winner?
Well, it makes Iran, it levels the playing field. So with other words, if prior to the pandemic and the economic collapse, you had a Saudi Arabia that was flush in cash, could spend what it wanted to spend, could manipulate oil prices by production going up and down, and had this religious outreach, versus an Iran that's sanctioned, whose revolution has gone off the tracks, is no longer attractive, and is struggling with its economy. Now you have two countries struggling with their economy, granted in different ways. Mm-hmm. The financial muscle as an asset is disappearing. The oil weapon, if you want to call it that, is disappearing. In that sense, that's to Iran's advantage. It levels the playing field.
Okay, so so basically Iran is the winner here because of the pandemic, basically at the expense of the Saudis, right?
Well, the answer is uh, a, a lot of the Saudi strategic advantage disappears,
Right,
and that potentially opens the door to some form of dialogue and some form
right,
of, they're not going to become buddy friends, but if you
right.
can get to a non-aggression agreement, if you can get to a security understanding, you've significantly reduced risk and reduced the temperature.
You're on the John Fredericks Radio Network. We're live in Nashville, Tennessee today, and we'll be here tomorrow too on our tour. We are with James Dorsey. James is a senior contributor, InsideArabia.com, based in Singapore in Asia. James, as always, thanks for joining us. The emphasis right now that the president is putting on China, and many of those in the media, like me, are, and talking about bringing our supply chain back and the fact that this came into the Wuhan lab and they have to be held accountable. And Senator Lindsey Graham wants to strip them of their sovereign immunity. We've got other senators that want to allow America to sue them, seize their assets. All of the attention on China, it almost makes the Iranian situation look kind of stupid to a lot of us. Like, we spent so much time on Iran, and yet you got China out here that, lied to the WHO ostensibly, continue to people saying, and the president yesterday saying it's worse than Pearl Harbor, that had they been truthful, what happened, 95% of this could have been avoided. Doesn't this just, as the public here in the U.S., like nobody's talking about Iran anymore? Doesn't that help them also,
Well,
that they're no longer the focus of the Americans' ire?
well, I think there are two issues here. One is, yes, they're not the focus, but if you were to put a vote in the Senate or the House for that matter, look at last week. You had 384 members of the House, with other words, a majority of Democrats, asking the president to prevent the lifting of the UN arms embargo on Iran. So the Iran sentiment is there, and it will not go away. And whenever Iran is an issue, it will return to what it is, even if the focus is on the pandemic. Now, the other side of the coin is, and this is where you're going to disagree with me, but fair enough, I agree with Trump on China, but I don't think it's China only. There are very few countries or very few leaders, and that goes from Xi Jinping to Khamenei in Iran, to Erdogan in Turkey, to Putin in Russia, and to Trump. They all, for either reasons of political fortune or for reasons of negligence, did not act on time, and as a result, we have the mess we have. Now, it starts in China, without question. That's where the virus erupted, and that's where the Chinese should have acted on day one, like Singapore did, like Taiwan did, like Korea did, and they should have been transparent about it. And if they had been true, we would have probably been able to evade a lot of this. But a lot of people followed in their footsteps, almost doing the same thing. And that's the problem to me. But I know you'll disagree on that.
I don't necessarily disagree with that. I do.
I'm glad.
Yeah, I mean, because look, there's a lot of culpability here. It certainly starts with the Chinese, but to be honest, James, there's huge culpability with the Italian government. Huge culpability. I mean,
Absolutely.
when their intel people knew something was going on, they continued to take plane load of low-wage Wuhan workers with their belt and road projects into northern Italy, right, in order to take advantage of that cheap labor. I mean, they were part of this as well,
Absolutely.
right?
No, everybody was part of it. Everybody a part of it. And let me take the thought further, if you're going to allow me.
Yes.
You tell me why this mismanagement of a crisis is less of a crime against humanity than a war crime.
None.
I silenced you.
In fact, worse. I mean, for those
Absolutely.
for those that unleash this, and look, I'm not a fan of Dr. Fauci, this bureaucrat in the United States has become a rock star. I think the guy should get fired, and investigated. This guy is now batting down the whole China theory. But, we've got now mounting evidence that the Chinese Communist Party was very culpable, and they knew there was a virus. They suppressed it. The 5 doctors that sent alarm bells, they all disappeared. We assumed they were assassinated. They're gone. You can't find them. They're gone. And they wouldn't allow travel into Beijing, but they allowed travel into northern Italy and all over the world. So, you have to say, if Xi is making a decision that nobody can travel to Beijing, but they can travel around the world, and he knew this virus was out there, is he not culpable of war crimes worse than anything we've ever seen?
Absolutely. And look, he stands at the top of the list. But that doesn't mean that everybody else is innocent. That's what I'm saying. But look, it starts with China. There's no question about it. Mm-hmm. No question about it. But as much, if you want to be just in this, it would be wrong to make China the scapegoat and give everybody else, let them free from any responsibility. Mm-hmm. That's what I'm saying. But it starts with China, sure.
Yeah, I think you're.
Look, I'm no. As you well know, I'm no fan of Xi Jinping. On the contrary.
Right. Well, President Trump yesterday, he made the statement that what they did was worse than Pearl Harbor. And I get the president's got trade deals and he wants them to buy our stuff, but at some point, you can't keep splitting the difference, right? And I get where the president's coming from, but at some point he's got to call this guy out. I was at a.
As I said,
go ahead.
On that point, I support Trump.
Yeah.
I just don't think it makes him gives him a brief of innocence. But look, I support him on the China.
We'll see how this plays out. I think in the U.S. we've got hysteria now that's gone off the charts. But we're out of time. I want to thank James Dorsey. James, always good to have you on. We'll see you next week. James live in Singapore. Go to Inside Arabia, based in the U.S. Go to InsideArabia.com.